All through the Old Testament, we hear about the promised land. God first spoke of the promised land to Abraham. And God told Abraham that he would lead him into a land that he would possess, and it would be for his seed and his seed's seed. And Abraham actually left his home in Ur to go and find that land. And when God showed him the land, he told him that as you are sojourning in this land, it will belong to your seed. And God showed Abraham visions of his seed, that they would be as many as the stars in the sky or the sands on the seashore. Now, Abraham did not actually see the fulfillment of that promise in his own lifetime. Although he lived in that land, he did not possess it. He was able to buy a little plot of land to bury his wife. But he never possessed that land. But the writer of Hebrews tells us by faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. And so that didn't mean, just because the promise was future, it didn't mean it wasn't going to be fulfilled. But something else that I want us to recognize in this passage that I just read is that the promises of God are inherited. They pass from one generation to another. So that promise wasn't just to Abraham. It was to Isaac. It was to Jacob. It was to Joseph. It was to all the children of Israel. So God's promises are inherited kind of like the family business or a family-owned farm that's passed down generation to generation. You get that picture. That the promises are actually an inheritance from God to us, and it's through the family generations. In Deuteronomy, we see the promise being spoken to the Israelites, who were Abraham's descendants. Hundreds of years later, God reiterated those promises. And in Deuteronomy, it says, "Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey." God began to describe to them this land because none of them had seen it. At this point, they'd been exiled in Egypt for hundreds of years. And they'd never even seen that land that Abraham had been in. And so God began to describe that land as a land flowing with milk and honey. The promised land. It's a good place. It's a land with streams and pools of water. It has springs flowing in the valleys. It's a land of wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates and olive oil. It is a rich and productive land, and God told them that there they would eat bread without scarcity. And he said, "You will lack nothing there." So that's the promised land. Wow, what a thing to look forward to, this place where they would lack nothing and every need would be provided, this place that was so productive and rich and fertile. Did you know that Israel is still one of the most productive countries in the world in terms of agriculture? Their Jaffa oranges are famous. They supply fruits and vegetables to much of Europe. And you think of the size of that nation. If you look at a map, it's itty-bitty-bitty. Tiny. And yet, if you're to go to a grocery store, and I can attest to this in Scotland when I was there for a year, vegetables, fruits from Israel in the grocery store provided. So it's a very productive land. So God's promise was absolutely true and is still holding true today, that it's productive. Now, a promise, when you think of it, is really only as good as the integrity and the faithfulness of the person that makes the promise. If you can't rely on them, then you cannot rely on the promises they make. But God is trustworthy. God is faithful. And so the promises of God can be relied on because God can be relied on. And that is what the Israelites had to learn and had to know in their hearts, that this promise will come to pass. Now, looking back years and years and years later, after they did get into the promised land, King Solomon looked back and said, you know, there has not failed one word of all the good promise that God gave through his servant Moses. So the recognition was given that the promises of God came true. Nehemiah said, you've made their sons as numerous as the stars in the sky. You brought them into the land that you told their fathers to enter and possess. So again, God is faithful, that we can rely on the promises that God makes. So then, when God offers a promised land to us, what is that promised land for us? It is a place where God's promises to us are fulfilled. Okay? So the promised land was the place where the promises were fulfilled. All the things that God had promised, all the things that God had told them were fulfilled in that land when they came in to possess it. So when you come into the promised land, you come into possession of the promises of God. And I think that's just the place where God's kingdom blessings are manifested in our lives. The place where not only our needs are met, but we are supplied by God's grace so that we can manifest God's goodness in the world. God has a purpose for fulfilling the promised land in our lives so that we can then reach out to others. The promises of God were simply words that God speaks and declares of what God will do. And many times you will see that they are conditional. If you do such and so, then I will. So on and so forth. So we have to realize that for us to walk in God's promises in our lives, or to take possession of the promised land, that there will be things required of us, but also those things won't just fall on us. They have to be possessed. They have to be taken and seized, so to speak. And so to possess the promised land took action on the part of the children of Israel. And we heard about Joshua. It was his commission to lead that nation in to possess the promised land. So they had to believe the promises, then they had to act on the Word of God. Now it's interesting, the Hebrew word to possess is to seize, to take possession of, to inherit, or to occupy. So it's almost something sometimes we have to do by faith. It is something we do by faith. God promised to give the land, but the Israelites had to take possession of that land. They had to move out in faith that God would be faithful to the promise. So you think of it, here they'd spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, ragtag bunch of people. They're being told that they're to come into a land that's full of fortified cities, trained armies, all their defenses secure around them. How on earth are they going to take possession of that land? Certainly not in their own strength or their own ability. All of the things God calls us to do will always seem so big, and there's a reason for that. We look and we say, oh, no way. How could we ever make this building accessible? 19 levels, or 17, whatever. No way. Well, you know why it's so big? Because we got a bigger God, and we won't be relying on ourselves, we'll be relying on our God.